Hey everybody, it's Richard Thomas.
And I'm Tiffany Thomas.
And we're coming to you live from the Lionheart Institute podcast studio to tell you thank you very much. You did it. We have been urging our audience, propelling our audience, even begging our audience to get us up over 1,000 subscribers. And it's been a magical couple weeks, couple months here where we are actually over 1,500 subscribers. I know it's a humble beginning. But as the Bible says, do not despise the day of small beginnings. We do not despise these days. We are very excited. And not only that, but there is this thing called watch hours that YouTube is very, very, very on point on. And it's 4,000 watch hours that you have to hit to be monetized and to kind of go to that next level. And very proud of our audience, very excited about our audience because we are over 4,000 watch hours. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to necessarily get monetized, but we are very, very hopeful. So we have decided, in an excitement over what's going on, that we're going to do a giveaway to our subscriber base. And we're so proud of you. We're so blessed to have you watching. Of course, we do so many different takes on success that we think that it's a very valuable approach that we take, whether it's interviews or whether it's our table talks, or now with Coaching the Champion dialogue that we're doing, which I'm so excited to unveil 49 other coaches over the next year that have done some incredible things. But Tiffany, can you kind of unfold a little bit on the subscription? And bear with us, I know it's a slow start. We're going to give you where to jump to in this flashing if you want to skip this part.
Yeah, so I'm super excited to be able to talk about this. As Richard said, we are so grateful for all of you who jumped on and subscribed to our channel and have spent the time watching our videos. It has meant a lot to us. And so as a thank you, we would like to give away a $50 Amazon gift card.
Say what?
Who doesn't shop on Amazon, right?
Get that spending on, baby.
Right. So in order to qualify for the drawing, here's a couple things that we're going to need you to do. One, you have to be a subscriber. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. Click the bell. Make sure you get the notifications. Ding, ding, ding. After you subscribe, make sure you click and like this video, comment below. And then at some point during this video, we are going to give you a password. It will just appear on the screen. So you will know when it's there.
With the magical word password next to it.
Yeah, so you'll know where it is. But you got to watch the video, the whole video, to catch so you don't miss on the password. When you get that password, just shoot us an email with it. Our email address is in the description. We will, of course, we'll give the full breakdown again in the description box so you don't miss out. But we just want to say thank you. We're going to pick a winner next week and we'll announce it on our video next week as well. And just thank you all again for your support. We really appreciate it.
So a quick summary, 4 things they need to do. Mm-hmm. They need to be a subscriber.
Yep.
They need to like this video or dislike it. That would be okay as well.
That's okay too.
Some kind of response. Number 3, they need to leave some kind of a comment. Good, bad, or indifferent.
Yep.
Right? And number 4, look for that password that you'll just email to us saying, hey, this is the password. Give me my Amazon. And if you've done those 4, then you'll be entered in a drawing that we'll do in-house. Kind of a no-look drawing, right? Where the magical person will get $50. So excited about where we're at and what we're doing.
Absolutely. It has been a journey, one we are excited to take with you. Those who have been with us since the beginning, we thank you so much. And those who are new, we are excited to welcome you aboard to the Lionheart Institute family. And we hope you enjoy this next video.
And one of the things that we've done at the Lionheart Institute podcast is we have actually embraced a ton of dialogue that we never thought that we would.
Right.
Much of that surrounding politics.
Yeah.
And about equality, the discussion of equality. Much more than I ever thought that I would ever embrace again, particularly since I did that in my early 20s in college. Founded a company with 2 other football players that I played with at the University of Washington, and we had a phenomenal time touring the area, Pacific Northwest, doing assemblies called Race Relations 2000, a throwback to the past. To all y'all, I love you, who know anything about that. but I never thought that we would get back into dialoguing about race relations.
Right.
Here we are, 2020, 2021.
Right.
And it seems like a lot of the dialogue that we spoke about in the late 90s, we're still talking about. With some of the stuff we talked about in the 70s and the 60s, we're still talking about now. And one of the accusations that I believe has unfairly come my direction, right, is, hey, Richard, why are you talking about so much hate?
Yes.
Right? And Richard, we know you as the bubbly, happy guy who is always speaking encouragement and love. And now all of a sudden you're focusing on this very negative thing called race. And I love, obviously, Dave Chappelle. I guess not obviously, not everyone does. But I love Dave Chappelle. And he says it's easier to get white people to talk about butt sex with their wife than it is to talk about race or politics. And I know that's absolutely disgusting. It's probably inappropriate. Maybe we'll even bleep that out if I can remember. However, it's very, very true. It's a topic that Caucasian, particularly Caucasian males, are very uncomfortable talking about. Right.
It's a trigger for a lot of white people. It is.
And now, so it's almost a role reversal that's happened, where anytime that race is talked about, it's almost like you've become the racist in addressing it, right? And so I want to encourage our audience, I'm still all about love. I'm still all about loving red, yellow, black, or white, whatever color you are, whatever nationality you are, whatever religious background you may come from, or maybe you don't come from any religious background, whatever you like to do with your dingle dangle, or you like done with your dingle dangles, right? I don't care who you are. I love you. I appreciate you. I respect you and I value you. But I think that uncomfortable conversations have to happen for us to improve. And so one of the things that we've really talked about is how, and this is really the topic of today's podcast, is how do we fight against hate in America? Particularly, how do we fight against hate with love in our hearts, right? And a willingness to still understand that there's a Second Amendment where people are not just going to be pacifists and hoping someday change will come. Right. Singing Kumbaya. Right. That change is necessary and we demand it now. So
absolutely.
It's a topic, I know it may be sensitive, but bear with us, enjoy this episode, because I think there's going to be some powerful breakthroughs. And just comment in below if you're ready for these kind of dialogues.
Well, we always talk about to understand the truth, to understand where we are today, you have to understand the history. You have to understand where it came from and why we are where we are today. It didn't just start out of nowhere.
And there's an argument. I wasn't ever a slave owner. Right. I never directly was benefited from the racism of the 60s or 50s or 30s or Jim Crow or redlining. But there's this trickle down that we don't really understand has affected America.
So we're going to do a little background of kind of the history of racism, hate, white supremacy, our stance on immigration. We're going to kind of talk about that. Over the last couple weeks, we've seen a lot of pain and suffering. We've seen these deaths and shootings from Atlanta to Boulder. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. There's no other words for it. And there's no reason for it. And so that's why it's important to talk about how we got here, because we can't fix this unless we know how it started.
One of the things that is really talked about is how serious is this issue in America? Right. There's a lot of dialogue about whether hate from a right-wing perspective, racial hate, white supremacy in America, where it lands on the list of priorities. And it seems to be at the number one spot as far as priorities. So I appreciate you running down the history of where it's at.
And it's not just here in America, because everywhere outside of America sees what's going on in America.
So good.
I spoke to a gentleman who was from Africa, Nigeria actually, and his family did not want him coming to America and marrying an American woman because of how black people were treated in this country. And his mother especially was like, no, I'm not gonna give you my blessing because I don't want you to go to America. I mean, think about that for a minute. I mean, we're one of the greatest nations in the world, but yet here's somebody from another country saying, I don't want you to go to America because it's not safe for you.
That's a powerful perspective.
Right. So how did we get here is the question, right? How did it come to this point? Well, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, defines hate and a hate crime as the violence of intolerance and bigotry intended to hurt and intimidate someone because of their race, their ethnicity, their national origin, their religion, or sexual orientation, or a disability. Now that is what they defined, how they define hate crimes.
And I think it's important that I brought up, don't mess with people about their dildo dangles.
Right. Now, it's important to understand too that the purveyors of these hate crimes use all sorts of different things. They use explosives, arson, weapons, vandalism, physical violence, and verbal threats of violence to instill fear in their victims, leaving them vulnerable to more attacks and feeling alienated, helpless, suspicious, and fearful. So it is not just a physical attack, it is also an attack on people. And I think that's really important to understand that.
Is that designed to keep people silent?
Absolutely.
Okay. Isolated,
yes.
and feel like their voice can't be heard even by authorities.
Silence is one of our greatest enemies. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People are afraid to speak up. They're afraid to rock boats. They're afraid of judgment. They're afraid of offending people. You know, as they say, we've become a society where everybody's offended by everything nowadays, right? So people are just afraid to speak up, but silence is our enemy. It is not our friend.
Deeply reminds me of the quote by Dr. King, obviously, that essentially comes to this. We'll not remember the acts of our enemies, mm-hmm. but we will remember the silence of our friends.
100%. And we are seeing that right now, and how important that statement is. Now, if we go back to the 1800s, so let's go back to kind of the beginning of most of this. Now, during the Reconstruction period, which was in the 1800s, hate crimes against freed slaves rose to astronomical levels. Okay, the slaves had just been freed, and so now we were dealing with white people who were not okay having black people walk among them freely, and at a level that was above being a slave. So during that time, state and local law enforcement did not tend to prosecute white people for hate crimes. So as you can imagine, most white people got away with, well, literally murder. Now, because of this, because federal law enforcement, because of this, federal law enforcement were forced to step in at a different level to protect African Americans.
I think in some ways, when we look at that, it's worthy to be noted. That's a good way to say it. It's worthy to be noted that Argentina, for instance, their approach was to, at the end of slavery, put an end to black life. Right?
Yeah, they executed.
And so, in many ways, America did take a little bit of a nobler approach than some countries and some regions, in the sense that, as a society, we attempted to somewhat breed freedom into our communities, right?
Right.
But we masked it by protecting white supremacy.
Yes.
And protecting those who committed acts of violence against black people, right, because we still didn't deem them as humans at the fullest capacity or level, right?
Right. So now you're dealing with state and local law enforcement not prosecuting people, letting murderers go free, and so now the federal government has to step in and say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't okay. We can't keep doing this. So Congress passed the Enforcement Act of 1870 to enforce the rights of due process of law and equal protection under that law. Now, an interesting fact that I didn't know that I recently learned, that in the 1800s, black people were not allowed to testify as witnesses against white people in a court of law. Now, given that most of these crimes were against people of color, they couldn't testify against the white people that harmed them or harmed their family or, committed crimes against them.
So during that era, I couldn't stand in the courtroom and say, hey, it was Tiffany, the girl sitting in front of me, that committed this violence.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. They decided that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was intended to protect the rights of the accused, not of the victims or witnesses. So when they tried to enforce saying black people had a right to testify, they said, oh no, this only protects them if they are the perpetrator, not if they are the victim. Now, because hate crimes had rose so dramatically during this time, in 1871, the government had to pass what they called the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan Act, which gave federal authorities the right to intervene in cases where there was a list of activities which included conspiracy to violate a civil right, threatening government officials, intimidating witnesses and jurors at a federal trial, interfering with the citizens' right to equal protection under the law, and interfering with the citizens' voting rights. Now, these were all very common offenses of the KKK during that time committed against African Americans.
Did you say voting rights?
Yeah, imagine that.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Sweet Georgia.
I know, Georgia. Definitely. So you have to understand, when you think about a state and local level, you're talking about governors, you're talking about mayors, police chiefs, all these people who were predominantly involved in the KKK. So there's a reason why people weren't being prosecuted for their crimes and why they were allowed to prosper during that time.
You're saying the haters were among us.
Oh, absolutely.
Gotcha.
100%. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, it was difficult to invoke hate crimes because it required the victim was engaged in what they deemed a federally protected activity. So this is why a lot of hate crimes were not prosecuted even with the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Now,
so let me understand, this had to be at a federal event, on a federal building.
Right.
Federal land.
Right. So, for example, if somebody was accosted at a gas station or at a movie theater or in a parking lot at a restaurant, they would not be charged with a hate crime because it wasn't considered a federal activity.
So the N-word could be thrown around, crosses could be burned.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't necessarily be considered a federal offense.
Correct, which is why we saw a lot of crosses burned in people's homes burned down, black people's homes burned down during that time, and they could not be prosecuted for hate crimes.
And I know, audience, this is a lot to chew on, specifically early in a dialogue like this, but it's important that we get our ducks in a row so you can begin to understand how we can continue to fight hate in America.
Right. So essentially, hate crimes were protected, and people could commit them with really no sense of any kind of punishment or consequences to them. Now, in 1998, with the racially motivated death of an African American man by the name of James Byrd Jr. by a group of white supremacists, and a hate crime involving the death of a gay student named Matthew Shepard, members of Congress moved to introduce a new federal hate crime law. Now, I want to point out, because this has come up in many dialogues we've had with many people, how Republicans have never committed any atrocities against African Americans. They've always been in support of them, and Democrats are the ones that have committed all the atrocities against them. We've had many debates, shall we say, with people on this topic. So I really want to point this out so you have a bigger picture. When Congress presented a bill to establish new laws regarding hate crimes, Republicans, which led the House and Congress at the time, wouldn't approve it. It took over 10 years for them to finally agree on a new bill.
So we're not talking about the 19th century or the 20th century. We're talking all the way into the 21st century.
Yes.
Until we begin to see things that's moved, right?
Yes.
So 2000 had to roll around before we saw these bills or these acts enacted against hate crimes in America.
Right, to actually charge people with hate crimes. So in 2009, Barack Obama actually signed into law the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Now, this was a big deal for a couple reasons. One, because it allowed the United States Attorney General to provide, at the request of state, local, and tribal law enforcement, financial, technical, prosecutorial, and any form of assistance in the criminal investigation or prosecution of any crime of violence that constitutes under federal law as a felony and is motivated by prejudice based on the actual and perceived race, color, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability of the victim.
So, a lot of ways, Obama, this is where kind of the groundwork for attacking Obama's approach to African American community or the black community, in contrast to what he was able to do for the homosexual community or transgender community, whatever terminology we may apply in those situations. That's where kind of that idea or concept was introduced, right? That he wasn't he did everything for everybody else's community, but he didn't do things for the black community. I want to say that that's obviously not the case. Obama
definitely
stepped up and proved himself a valiant defender of the black community.
He did.
To the greatest extent of his capacity, number one, which they would hear. And number two, just because he dominoed other communities into the fight against racism does not mean that racism was not frontal on his mind in addressing it.
So essentially now local and state law enforcement could have the funding from the federal government to be able to investigate and actually prosecute genuine hate crimes, which is something they didn't have before. And also, this new Prevention Act was really big because it removed the federal activity restrictions from the 1968 Civil Rights Act. So now it could be on anything. It could be in your home, it could be on the street, it could be in a grocery store. It didn't matter anymore. So now people were protected no matter where they were. If it was a hate crime, that person could be charged for a hate crime.
Private school, public
any
school.
Any place, yes.
An event of any sort. What if it happened at a person's residence?
Then they would still be charged with a hate crime if it was motivated based on any of those descriptions that was included in the act.
Which is still difficult to prove, right?
So today it's still difficult to prosecute hate crimes. You'd think it would be a lot easier, but they have to actually be able to prove that the person was motivated by the one on the list of the act, because they have to check people's Facebook, social media accounts, emails, see if there was any slurs racially or any other kind against this person because of those items listed. And that isn't always easy to do.
As a matter of fact, that's why in so many cases there's such a rush to social media to take, when violent acts happen, to take those accounts down.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the reasons why you assume it's obviously to protect the innocent, right?
Yeah.
You don't want people all of a sudden jumping on somebody's Facebook and you find out 3 months later that, hey, it wasn't even that person, right? But in some senses, it's because that person is very actively cleaning up their trying to delete texts and so forth. And so a lot of times when we start looking at Facebook or we start looking at the government looking at social media organizations like Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or any of those type of social media platforms, it's important to understand that they're also trying to protect the history so that this individual cannot just go and destroy evidence, and then we have no ability to go back and look at that to say, hey, no, this person has established a history of hate. And so I think that's important. And then America, of course, we've long had this weird relationship with people of color coming into America. Right? We've long had this very odd relationship, and watched a great video the other day called Whitewashing in America, right? And it talked about Irish people, how long did it take you to become white? Italians, how long did it take you to become white? But even their skin tone gave them an opportunity. Where in a lot of times in immigration, I'd love for you to start to unfold that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so, we've talked about kind of the history of where hate crimes started and how we have addressed them or not addressed them. So I want to talk a little bit about America's stance historically on immigration. So immigration is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people. We saw that tremendously during the Trump administration. Trump's incredibly... I don't even know what to say, but his stance...
Hate-filled rhetoric.
Yes, thank you. On immigration. And we see that greatly with the right wings. And Republicans have been against immigration literally since the beginning of immigration.
And of course, it's cloaked in this idea to protect jobs, to protect our government, right? To protect servicing the needs of the many over the needs of the Americans.
It's about protecting Americans, right? So I want to give a little history on how far we went in this country to prevent people of color from coming from their country into America.
And it's important to understand how far we went, because
Yes.
it's an indicator of how far we'll go.
Yes,
Right.
100%. And I started doing a lot of research after the heartbreaking shootings at the spas in Atlanta, and I remember seeing a lot of interviews being done with Asian people and them talking about these different laws and stuff that were enacted in America. And I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, I'd never heard of that before. I didn't know that there was laws put in place specifically for Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants. And I was like,
who were a tremendous help in expanding the United States into the West, right?
I remember in my history class, the only thing I remember hearing about Chinese, since they were the first to come here, was that they helped build the railroads. And now I knew they weren't treated well, but
Sure.
they were treated obviously better than the black slaves were. But they helped build the railroads, and that was the extent.
And in some cases, in some cases, they were not.
Right.
They were a little bit more limited, but I've spoken to many Chinese Americans of today in history classes and just throughout my time on Earth, that they had horrific situations that they faced.
Yeah.
And so
I was genuinely appalled that the only thing I knew about the Asian history in this country was that the Chinese helped build railroads and then Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And then the Japanese internment camps that came from all that. That was the only thing I knew. So this was genuinely shocking.
And they have a long history, just as African Americans do, serving in our military, serving in Congress and in places of influence, and serving our communities. And so don't just limit the Chinese impact or any Asian Americans' impact in America just to Chinatown or Koreatown, because it's much more widespread than that.
Absolutely. So, and generally, I was absolutely appalled that this isn't something that's taught in our history class. And I actually reached out to other people who had never heard of a lot of this either. They're like, we were never taught that in class. So it's definitely appalling to me. So the truth is, America has a very, very long history of white supremacy in this country. Now, look, I know people are not comfortable with that word.
Can you say trigger?
It's a huge trigger for people. And I know people don't want to acknowledge how the foundation of this country has always been about white supremacy.
Because it's such a great country. In so many ways, it's difficult to believe that a country based on so much moral purity, so much character, so much valuing work ethic and the individual, and believing and inspiring in small business to rise up and feed and protect families and the heart of Americans. It's hard to think of all this good and yet all that evil on the balancing. How does that balance out on the scales of justice, right? When we're such a justice-driven society, and yet history has proven that so much of it is based in white supremacy.
Oh, tremendously. So if we go back to 1852, there was a tremendous, massive crop failure in China. Now, because of that, it resulted in about 20,000 Chinese immigrants coming to San Francisco, especially because they had recently heard about the gold rush going on in California. So they thought, well, we're starving to death over here in China. Let's go to America. Let's be a part of this gold rush and start a new life. So many racially motivated hate crimes perpetuated on Chinese immigrants from white miners. And it escalated greatly. So much so that California actually later that same year, they enforced a $3 a month tax designed to specifically target Chinese miners.
My goodness.
Right. So now they're taxing Chinese miners over white miners. Now, by 1870, Chinese miners had paid roughly around $5 million to the state of California due to the foreign miner tax.
I think for fun, we're going to put the quote of what that translates to in American dollars today.
Right. I mean, in 1870, $5 million.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just insane. Now, just like African American, Chinese immigrants were also not allowed to testify in court as a victim or witness until well after 1882. Now, due to the upset by white Americans over Chinese immigrants, predominantly in the state of California, the United States introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
It is a doozy.
Now, this one I had never heard of at all. I'm disgusted that I didn't know this even existed. But what this did is this suspended all Chinese immigration from coming to the U.S. for 10 years and declared current Chinese immigrants not eligible for naturalization. So the Chinese immigrants already here could not become citizens.
And so when you begin, and I know that there's some crazy stats that you're going to continue to go
Right.
through, but when we have a president shouting the Chinese virus,
Right.
that is not just terminology that is rooted in today's language,
Right.
This is not just something that is something he decided because it's from China to begin to implement. It was a deep scarring
Yes.
wound that he began to try to reopen
Yes.
up as an attack
Yeah.
against the Chinese community, number one Chinese, and then number two against Asian America as a whole, right? And Doctor, I want to call him Dr. Trump because he's Dr. Evil to me. But Trump, he's not an ignorant man.
Right.
His gestures, there's a lot of what they call rhythmic statements to what he does. There's a lot of grounded things in white supremacy that he does as far as body language, gestures that he makes. Stating Chinese virus was not by accident. That was an intentional act to begin to rip open this wound.
Yeah, we're definitely going to fold a little bit more of that a little bit later in this video because
Good.
I definitely have some stuff to talk about on that topic. But let's go back to the history a little bit so we can continue to understand the progression of white supremacy and hate crimes in this country.
It's powerful.
So in 1892, California extended the Chinese Exclusion Act ban for an additional 10 years and required all Chinese immigrants to have special documentation on them at all times. Now, it was called a certificate of residence. Now, if they were caught without their papers, they were imprisoned and forced to have hard labor, free labor, or deportation.
So a form of slavery.
Basically, yeah, aka slavery, indentured servitude.
Right.
And now, mind you, this was only in the state of California at this time. So they wanted to extend it another 10 years, so a total of 20 years that they specifically did. Now, a Chinese immigrant could only receive bail if a credible white witness was to vouch for them. Now, I'm sure we can imagine how many times that happened.
Sure.
Now, fast forward 10 more years, and in 1902, Chinese immigration was made permanently illegal. Yeah, yeah. So after 1902, they said, nope, we don't want any more Chinese immigrants coming to this country.
After all their service, after all
Right.
their devotion to the workforce.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, this later spurred another movement called the Immigration Act of 1924. So they didn't just stop there. Now, this was to restrict immigration against other undesirables. So undesirable groups such as Middle Easterns, Hindu and East Indians, and Japanese. So pretty much all of Asia and some parts of Europe. Now, President Coolidge at the time, he stated, America must remain American, aka white. Now, I would like to point out that no white European countries received any kind of immigration bans.
Right.
So if they looked white, they were not subjected to any of these immigration bans. They were strictly all for people of color.
If you were white, let it flow.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to understand because you have to see this, there's a pattern here, right? We created a pattern of white supremacy in this country and wanting to maintain that and sustain that. So when we talk about wanting to maintain the purity of Americans in this country, it was all about maintaining white supremacy. Now, Asians were seen as a threat, as I said, to the purity of white America and were depicted as disease-ridden and filthy, as well as religious and moral heathens who threatened a Christian America. So again,
Mind-boggling.
you see Americans creating stigmas, creating false narratives to justify their treatment of people who they didn't like, people who didn't look like them.
I think it's really important that we begin to slow down this next point, because obviously as a father of two beautiful daughters,
Right.
I think that it's offensive beyond words, number one. Number two, it grieves my spirit. And number three, I think there's a horrific pattern in the way America has treated women in general.
Yeah.
But certainly women of color.
For sure.
And I want you to make it really clear on the approach that was taken to women of color.
Yeah.
Right? Because, again, we're talking about all of these immigrants from China at the time, resistance to immigration in the 1920s from Middle Eastern countries, Japanese, from India, from Hindus and other religions, right? Even though we've long said that America is the melting pot, right?
Oh, yeah.
We only melt to a certain degree of Caucasian, right? And we keep that pretty baseline. If we're not a white cream, we're not in the mix,
Right.
There's only so much flavor that the Caucasian palate will take.
For sure.
But this is extremely offensive because what it did is it basically put all of our daughters in jeopardy of people of color. So can you unfold that a little bit, because I think it's crucial for anyone that fears God, loves God, or cares about people and humanity to begin to understand to the extent they would go.
Now, if you had a chance to watch our American slavery videos on what the truth of that is, and if you haven't, I highly encourage you to check those out. But we talked about white America, how they deemed black women as Jezebels, promiscuous, wantons, which justified their rape. So America has a very long history, of sexualizing women of color. And then they start to spread stereotypes and narratives about these women to make everybody believe that they are true. Now, unfortunately, Asian women were no different. They were attacked as well. And white American men said that they were promiscuous, they were prostitutes who spread sexual deviance and sexually transmitted diseases to good American men. So therefore, we couldn't have them in this country. And sadly, the sexualization of Asian women greatly still exists in this country, which has led to crimes against these women because of these false lies and these narratives that have been around for hundreds of years. So now, in order to prevent Asian families from forming and establishing roots here in America, America decided to pass another law to help prevent that from happening. Now, this was called the Page Act of 1875.
And that seems like one of the strategies of white supremacy, right? Divide the family.
Absolutely.
Right?
Split the families up.
Demoralize the man, right? Cause the woman to be painted as a Jezebel, right? And to make sure that the family unit as a whole does not become empowered. Right?
Absolutely.
And so this act had a lot to do with that.
It did. Now, this act was specifically targeting Chinese women, period. Now, this was created to reduce the amount of Asian women allowed into this country by significant numbers. The law stated that no woman could come into this country who was coming with lewd intentions, promiscuous behavior, or prostitution. Now, considering that they deemed pretty much all Chinese women as this, then it prevented Chinese women from coming into this country.
And it allowed them to ring the higher moral bell.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. So what happened under this act, Chinese women who came to San Francisco were subjected to barbarous, humiliating, invasive, and discriminatory medical exams. And this was to determine if they had pure intentions or not for coming to this country.
Disgusting.
I can't even imagine what they did to these poor women to determine whether they were pure of hearts and minds and body. But because it was so horrific, most Chinese women said, not a chance. I'm not going.
Back.
Yes. Yeah. Stories kept coming back from the horrific treatment of these women. And Chinese women said, I'm not going to put myself through this, and they stopped coming.
And the truth is that still today in the world we live in, although America has, because of some of the world wars, because we've stuck our nose in other people's business and expansion, we've tried to rewrite history in the world. Much of the world still sees America from that perspective.
Yes.
And so when we address outside countries, we wonder why we are the enemy, right?
Right.
Why they decide that there's holy war against us. Well, it's because of atrocities like this that has been our hallmark of our society, not just from our generation, right? But generation after generation, we seem to find a way to communicate hate to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. So I would also like to point out that Chinese immigrants and their American families, they weren't even allowed to become U.S. citizens until 1943. Yeah. So almost 100 years they'd been here and they couldn't even become citizens. Now, all of these bans, I want to note, were all lifted with the Civil Rights Act of 1965.
Now, when we talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1965, however, a lot of people don't realize that 1965 isn't some magical date that happened on a calendar, right? I know, for instance, our sister state, Oregon, didn't recognize it well until the 70s, right? And so when you begin to declare the 1965 Act as though it was this holy statement by America that, hey,
everything just was made right.
Our atrocities of yesterday are over. We're now a colorblind society. That is the furthest thing from the truth, right? Those things not only trickled into the 70s, into the 80s, into the 90s, but are still very real in the world that we live in today.
Yeah, for sure. You know, after reading all of this and researching this, I was truly just appalled, really. I was disgusted and just saddened by how America treated people that were different. I mean, we saw this with slavery, but we continue to see this pattern of hate against people who are not white. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it.
And I really encourage you, if you get an opportunity, to watch that documentary, Whitewashed in America, because I think it's important for our Italian brothers, our Irish brothers and sisters, to recognize you had to earn your white.
Right.
And that white did come very quickly, but you are 100% correct. When you first hit the continent, you weren't necessarily seen as white. Right? And yet now we have this modern day kind of white supremacy that's reemerging, this white nationalist concept, right? But really it's been hidden in the fiber of our country and it's never gone away.
Yeah.
But can you begin to talk a little bit about this new approach of modern day white supremacy and white nationalism?
Yeah, I think it's important, as you said, to really understand that white supremacist ideologies have never left politics and policies in this country, especially for those who are on the far right. It's crazy when you start to listen to things that really come out of people's mouths. And when you start to digest the words that are very clearly and specifically spoken, you will start to hear these white supremacist ideologies coming out of people, especially in politics. And it will astound you when you start to break that down.
And we've often learned to look at politics from the lens of Republican or Democrat.
Right.
We've learned to listen to it from the lens of liberals and conservatives.
Yeah.
Right? But when you begin to understand the true history of America, you begin to see it through a different lens of white supremacists and those who are not white.
Yes.
Right? And so if you begin to, and I'm not saying that is the only lens we should look at America through, because it isn't, right?
Right.
There are some amazing things that have gone in to the mixing bowl of America. The Statue of Liberty, give me all your poor and your oppressed, right? That have turned out miraculous stories, right?
Yeah.
But when you begin to look at it through the lens of white supremacy, you understand, regardless of what party happens to be in charge, that there is a taint of our society that continue to write into law racist literature, racist legislation, propaganda that is very loud, very specific.
Yes.
That if it's not white, it's not right. And
Yep.
if it's not right, it's not American.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Break me down. Give me break dancing, girl. Part 1 was something else right there. Hate in America.
Yeah. It's a real thing.
Man, that's a real deal right there. That's a powerful, powerful
Yeah.
episode. I'm so excited. I think we've gotten it broken down to 3. It might be 4 pieces, but pretty sure that we've got this into a 3-part series on how to deal with hate in America. And it is so powerful. It's revolutionary, really, in the concept of bringing love and answers. But we have to have the history first. So a lot of this is just bringing us historical context so we can begin to apply the answer, which is love. But if we deny the truth, we can never enter into love. My friends, so many of us are lost in the deception of the lie that we can never get to the truth of love through the brokenness and the hurt of racism. And so in dealing with understanding, all of a sudden we grow, and as we grow, we can become difference makers in the world that we live in. This episode, we also did something very exciting and very special because we've been working very, very hard in eclipsing a number that to the YouTube world is very important, which is 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 watch hours.
Right.
Well, we've absolutely crushed it. As a matter of fact, we thought that we would have hit this 3 months from now, right? And we're actually about 3 months ahead of schedule. You guys have been such an awesome audience. But in celebration of that, we are doing a giveaway. So would you tell them about it?
Yeah, absolutely. If you didn't catch it at the beginning of the video, we are giving away a $50 Amazon gift card as a thank you to our wonderful subscribers and Lionheart Institute podcast community. We are so grateful for you.
Yeah.
As I said in the beginning of the video, to qualify, you need to be a subscriber. So if you are watching this for the first time on our channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss out on any videos.
So good.
Like or dislike the video, and then comment down below. Tell us your thoughts of the video.
It's awesome.
Once you've done that, find the password in this video. We're going to release it. It's going to pop up on the screen at some point during the video, so you need to watch all of it. Once you get the password, shoot us an email with it, and that is all going to be in the description of this video, so you'll be able to have all the instructions along with our email address. Once you give us the email address and you've taken care of those 3 other things, we will put you into the pot to win an Amazon gift card, and we will pull a winner next week.
We'll do a blind draw.
Yes, of course, and we will announce that on one of our videos for next week.
So excited that you're a part of this Lionheart Institute podcast episode. Remember, we have talk shows that we do, and a new one called Coaching the Lion. Coaching the Champion, Coaching the Lion. That'd be interesting. But Coaching the Champion, where we're talking about some of the most important coaches throughout history and the difference their principles can make in helping you become a success. So God bless you and be a part of this. Thank you so very much. Again, I'm Richard Thomas.
I'm Tiffany Thomas,
And we'll see you next time.
stick around for part 2.
Woo woo.